When the soul is neglected, it appears as symptom in the body. These words are not metaphorical, they are prophetic. What is denied in the psyche becomes tension in the flesh. What is repressed in the spirit will echo in the organs. There is no true separation between body and soul. They whisper to each other constantly. When one grows silent, the other speaks loudly. And it is often in abstinence, when the body is quiet, that we finally hear the voice of the soul. Let me ask you something. Have you ever fasted, not just from food, but from stimulation, from pleasure, from distraction, from the noise that fills the modern life with constant motion? What did you hear when it all went quiet? Most people are terrified of silence, not because of silence itself, but because of what it reveals. It unmasks the emptiness behind the addictions. It exposes the discomfort buried beneath the compulsions. It drags to the surface the questions we spend our lives avoiding. Who am I without these pleasures? What is left when I am not consuming, chasing, or numbing? In the ancient world, abstinence was not repression, it was refinement. It was a path to clarity, a ritual of attunement. Abstinence, in its truest form, is not about denial for the sake of punishment. It is about interruption, a pause that breaks the unconscious cycle, a way to regain power over what once controlled you. For every appetite you resist consciously, a hidden truth is revealed. Every time you silence the cravings of the flesh, the voice of the soul grows clearer. Why then do we fear abstinence? Or why do we equate it with suffering or loss? Because we have built a culture around indulgence. We mistake consumption for connection. We confuse access with abundance. And in doing so, we have anesthetized ourselves from the very essence of our being. We no longer know the difference between desire and addiction. We no longer recognize that the more we overfeed the body, the more we starve the soul. There is an ancient wisdom in abstinence, not as a permanent state, but as a rhythm. The soul thrives in rhythm, day and night. Inhale and exhale, work and rest, expression and silence. When you honor this rhythm, you remember who you are. But when you break the rhythm, when you consume endlessly, when you stimulate without pause, you create noise, spiritual noise that drowns out intuition, that buries the voice of the inner guide, that clouds the mirror in which the soul once saw itself. There is a great illusion in the modern world that the body's pleasure must always be pursued. But pleasure, without consciousness, becomes a trap. It becomes the very prison we think we are escaping from. I do not mean that pleasure is wrong. Quite the opposite. It is sacred. But when it is divorced from spirit, when it is used as an escape from self-awareness, it becomes dangerous. It becomes the mask we wear to hide our wounds. True abstinence is not about shame. It is about presence. It is about turning the lights inward. It is about creating space in which the unconscious can rise to the surface. When you stop running, you begin to feel. And when you begin to feel, you begin to heal. Abstinence is the quiet in which trauma reveals itself. It is the empty room where buried memories return. It is the waiting place where the ego loosens its grip and the soul begins to speak again. Many of the problems we label as depression, anxiety, burnout are not merely chemical or circumstantial. They are spiritual. They are the consequence of a life without silence, a life without restraint, a life in which we have become addicted to stimulation and allergic to stillness. We have lost the art of waiting, the grace of doing nothing, the sacredness of saying no. Abstinence teaches us all of these things. What is abstinence, truly? It is not only sexual restraint or fasting from food. It can be the choice to stop engaging in drama, the decision to withhold judgment, the discipline of turning off the screen, the sacred act of listening more than speaking. Abstinence is the invitation to feel what you were too busy to notice. It is the fire in which old identities are burned and new truths are born. Why does abstinence feel like death to the ego? Because it is the death of control, the death of image, the death of distraction. And yet in this death is the rebirth of soul. The ego is addicted to doing, to appearing, to possessing. The soul is nourished by being, by witnessing, by surrender. And so the practice of abstinence becomes a bridge from ego to essence, from compulsion to consciousness, from noise to knowing. When the body is silent, the soul remembers. It remembers what matters. It remembers what hurts. It remembers what you were created for. Abstinence reveals the motives behind our behaviors. It shows us which appetites are sacred and which are manipulations of unresolved pain. It helps us distinguish between the hunger of the soul and the cravings of the wounded child within. And in doing so, it brings us back into alignment. But here is the challenge: abstinence requires solitude. And solitude is where we meet the parts of ourselves we've been taught to fear, the rage we buried, the grief we dismissed, the longings we abandoned. Abstinence strips away the armor so that we may finally see the wound. And this is terrifying, but it is also the beginning of liberation, because you cannot heal what you refuse to feel. You cannot change what you will not confront. I have seen many people chase spiritual highs while avoiding this process. They chant, meditate, fast from food, yet remain addicted to approval, to performance, to distraction. This is not abstinence, it is spiritual bypassing. Real abstinence is not glamorous, it is messy, it is raw. It is the moment you sit in the ache of your loneliness without reaching for a distraction. It is the choice to grieve fully instead of numbing with consumption. It is the courage to wait when every part of you wants to escape. There is no enlightenment without abstinence. Not because suffering makes you holy, but because presence makes you whole. And abstinence is the doorway to presence. It is the container in which your chaos can be witnessed. It is the pause that makes integration possible. It is the fast that reveals what you were truly feeding. We think that addiction is a disease of the weak. It is not. It is the absence of ritual, the absence of initiation, the absence of silence. Addiction is what grows when abstinence is feared, when we are never taught to sit with pain, when we are never shown how to hold desire without acting on it. Abstinence teaches you that you are not your craving, that you are not your fear, that you are not your past. It teaches you that you can feel the fire and not be burned by it. And so my invitation to you is this: begin again. Choose one place in your life to practice abstinence, not to punish yourself, not to impress others, but to remember who you are. Let the silence stretch, let the cravings speak, let the emotions surface, and do not run, just listen. Listen with your body, listen with your breath, listen with your soul. Something holy is trying to speak through you, but it will not shout over your distractions. It will wait quietly until you are ready to return. Abstinence is not the end, it is the beginning of depth, the beginning of vision, the beginning of a life not driven by impulse, but by inner truth. It is a sacred rebellion in a world that worships speed and consumption. It is the slow return to sanity, to stillness, to the source. When the body goes silent, the soul speaks. And when the soul speaks, the whole world begins to heal. When the soul finally speaks, it doesn't always whisper beauty. At first, it groans. It cries out with the weight of everything you buried. The soul has waited patiently behind every avoidance, every substance, every person you used to not feel your own depth. So when it speaks with the voice of ancient grief. And that is precisely why most people flee from abstinence. It awakens what they spent years sedating. But this is not a punishment, or this is a gift, because no transformation happens without contact. You must come into contact with your longing, with your sorrow, with your lost innocence. Abstinence removes the veil. You stop anesthetizing and start remembering. You remember the first wound, you remember the split that disconnected you from your essence, and in that memory, you begin the long return home. This is why abstinence is not a practice for the faint of heart. It is not for those seeking superficial peace. It is for the brave, the ones willing to descend into themselves, to confront the shadow, to sit with the sacred ache that lies at the core of being human. Because only those who are willing to feel deeply can ever live fully. Numbing is not living. It is spiritual sleepwalking. You must understand your body is not your enemy, nor is your desire, but they must become conscious. When you abstain, you are not rejecting the body, you are listening to it. You are asking, what am I really hungry for? What wound am I feeding? What fear am I hiding behind this pleasure? These are not questions of morality. They are questions of meaning, of integration, of awakening. The modern mind treats abstinence as deprivation, but in truth, it is refinement, like fire that purifies gold. Abstinence burns away the illusions you cling to. You begin to see clearly, you begin to feel again, you begin to reclaim power over what once ruled you. And in that space of stillness, something ancient stirs. The soul stretches its limbs, it begins to dance again, not for others, not for performance, but for truth. There is a strange thing that happens when you enter the silence of abstinence. You begin to notice synchronicities. You begin to dream more vividly. Your intuition sharpens. The unconscious, no longer drowned in noise, begins to speak in symbols, in sensations, in subtle waves of knowing. This is not magic. It is the natural intelligence of the psyche once given room to breathe. When we abstain, we do not lose. We return. We return to our original sensitivity. We return to our forgotten values. We remember the sacredness of things we once consumed mindlessly. We begin to taste the sacred in simplicity, in breath, in presence. We no longer need to chase the extraordinary because we find the extraordinary in stillness, in slowness, in silence. The fear people feel when abstaining is not from the absence of pleasure. It is from the presence of themselves. They do not fear the silence, they fear what they will hear. They fear that beneath all their striving and seeking, there is still pain unhealed, still a self unloved, still a voice ignored. But this fear is the doorway. It is the guardian to the inner temple. And it only asks that you do not run, that you stay, that you listen. I have seen many attempt abstinence only to turn it into a performance, a rule, an identity. But this too is ego. True abstinence is not something you wear. It is something you surrender to. It is humble. It is quiet. It is between you and your soul. It asks nothing of the world but everything of your honesty. It is not something you boast about. It is something you live, something you embody. And what does the soul say? When it finally has your attention, it says, "Thank you for remembering me. Thank you for making space for me to speak. Thank you for not abandoning me in the name of productivity or success or pleasure. Thank you for not covering me up with noise. I have waited for this. I have waited for you." You may think that abstinence will make you less alive, that it will take color from your life, but the opposite is true. Once you move through the initial discomfort, you begin to feel more. You begin to see beauty in ordinary things. You begin to touch life with reverence. You no longer need intensity to feel alive because you have found aliveness in your being, in your breath, in your now. And something else happens. You begin to trust yourself again. You begin to see that you can sit with discomfort without fleeing, that you can witness your pain without needing to fix it, that you can exist without being addicted to escape. And this trust becomes strength, it becomes dignity, it becomes freedom. The world does not want you to know this, because a person who has met their soul is dangerous to the systems of distraction. You can no longer be controlled by fear or by longing. You are no longer easy to manipulate. You have found your center. And from that center, you cannot be bought, nor broken, nor blinded. You are free, not because life is easy, but because you have become rooted in truth. There is a kind of joy that only abstinence can give you. Not the joy of a quick fix or a temporary high, but the joy of being in right relationship with yourself. The joy of knowing that you are no longer betraying your essence for comfort. The joy of silence that sings, of emptiness that holds you, of waiting that heals. And from this place, you re-enter the world differently. You no longer take from people what you should be giving yourself. You no longer use pleasure to avoid presence. You no longer chase what you have already become. You walk with humility. You speak with intention. You live with depth. This is the paradox of abstinence. It is the path of less that gives you more. Less stimulation, more sensitivity, less noise, more clarity, less control, more trust. And in this reversal, you find the soul's secret that nothing outside of you can ever satisfy what only presence can touch. When the body goes silent, the soul begins its work. It is the work of remembering, of grieving, of releasing, of loving, of transforming. This is not easy work. It is sacred work. It is the work that the world needs most. Because the world is full of noise but starving for wisdom. Full of speed but lacking in meaning, full of pleasure but empty of peace. You, who are called to abstinence, are not called to suffering. You are called to sacredness. You are called to be a vessel for what the world has forgotten. You are called to embody stillness in a frantic age. You are called to live in alignment with the soul. And so the invitation is this return to silence. Let the body rest, let the cravings pass, let the ego loosen, and in the stillness, listen. Listen not just with your ears, but with your whole being. Something ancient is rising in you, something true, something holy. Do not fear the silence. It is not your enemy. It is your midwife. It is birthing the self you have always been. The self you lost in noise, the self you forgot in striving, the self that knows, that loves, that sees clearly, the self that is not addicted to survival, but open to transcendence. When the body goes silent, the soul speaks, and when the soul speaks, life becomes sacred again.